Good morning. My name is Jerry Stockdale. I'm from the University of Northern Iowa at Cedar Falls, and I'm the moderator for the first session. I'm afraid I'm going to have us get started off by breaking one of Maryland's first rules. I had originally understood that we had an hour and a half for this session, so I gave the panelists each a little more time than I should have, because it turns out that we have an hour. So I think there'll be a little less time for discussion of these first papers, but hopefully we'll be able to save time for some. I intend to make the introductions short and get right on with the people. There is one comment, though, that I would like to make, and that is that it is somewhat humbling for myself to be here speaking, or at least moderating a panel, when there are so many of you that are out there, people whose names I've heard for years, who have paid their dues in a way that I haven't, and probably a good many of the rest of us haven't. But it's an honor to be here with some of the other people who are on the program. I'd like to start with the first presentation, which will be by Christine Mchugh, who's now at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Christine is the author of several articles, papers, and reviews dealing with populism and related issues. Of special interest to me, and possibly to some of you, is the fact that she's written several things on Edward Bellamy, who is, I think, a fascinating author, and was, for me at least, very stimulating in terms of developing my interest in the social sciences. So let's start right off with Christine.
I was asked to discuss some facets of populist ideology this morning. So I'd like to, I've centered basically on two that I'd like to share with you. My interest focuses on populist ideology, and I've tried to kind of isolate and analyze certain of the values and attitudes, the worldview of the people who made up the populist movement in the 1880s and 1890s. I think this is important because populism was the last massive serious challenge to corporate America, and those of us here still engaged in that struggle, I think we have something to glean from the valiant effort that populists waged. This morning I'd like to mention two components of populist ideology. The first one is producerism, and the second one is republicanism. Populists defined themselves as producers. They viewed themselves as productive workers engaged in worthwhile toil for the benefit of themselves and the nation. Work, populists believed, was an economic necessity, a social duty, and a psychic need. Because work was an economic necessity, every citizen therefore had, quote, a natural right, unquote, to gainful employment. Equally important, every citizen had a social duty to labor and to contribute to the national storehouse of wealth, as past generations had done for the present generation. And finally, toil was the vital expression of the human condition, conferring meaning and dignity to people's lives. Employing this value system, then, populists divided American society into two classes: the producers and the non-producers, or parasites. Producers were individuals who labored, who created needed goods and service through legitimate toil. Being a producer was not determined by one's occupation, nor by one's relationship to the means of production. Either a worker or an owner could be a producer. Populists did contend, however, that labor took precedent over capital, but this did not imply any inherent antagonism between the two. Quite the contrary, the populist vision of a cooperative commonwealth was rooted in a belief that capital and labor should be complementary. The legitimacy of capital, however, was not automatic. It had to meet two tests. One, how was the capital amassed? And two, to what use was it put? In Hamlin Garland's novel, A Spoil of Office, he has one of his characters succinctly state this position, quote, "It ain't a question of how much a man's got, but how he got it," unquote. Those possessing wealth must have earned it through productive labor, and they must use it in socially beneficial ways. Producerism also included the expectation of an equitable correlation between expended toil and monetary reward. The capitalist's ability to appropriate labor was acceptable to the extent that labor received a, quote, just reward, and the capitalist received a, quote, reasonable return. The populists had no specific quantitative measure here of what was unreasonable or excessive profits. Indeed, given their own marginal situation, they had no trouble locating the ones with the excessive wealth. The producers were the victims, therefore, of a small class of individuals, these parasites, who the populists often said accumulated, not earned, their wealth. That was an important distinction. Their wealth was accumulated, not earned. And they had accumulated this wealth by expropriating an excessive proportion of the value of the goods created by the workers or the producers. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the many parasites that the populists attack: land speculators, bankers, other land agents, and railroads, middlemen. Let me give one example as far as middlemen goes, the populist condemnation of them as economic bloodsuckers. One agrarian painted a picture of the kind of market chain. On one side was the farmer, one end was the farmer producing the crops. At the other end is the person needing the food, and in between were dozens of handlers, people dipping in a percentage here and a percentage there all along the way. This agrarian said, quote, like a bucket brigade at a fire. An additional indictment of the parasites centered on their refusal to acknowledge the crucial social dimension of work. Parasites did not labor, they took no pride in the particular integrity of the goods, and they were solely interested in their pecuniary gain. I suggest that Producerism explains a number of things about the populist movement, and I'd like to give several examples of that this morning. I think Producerism goes a long way in explaining the shared values that populists had, in the sense that they were very interested in attracting blacks to the movement, labor to the movement, ethnics to the movement. I think Producerism was the common denominator by which they believed they could reach out to other segments and classes in the society. What we all shared then was being producers, and they believed that they could attract other people in the society to their movement because their political party alone represented the interests of what populists often called, quote, the producing classes, unquote. Producerism also goes, I think, a long way in helping to explain populist outrage, their incessant, virulent attacks on two groups. The first group was a category they called the money kings. And the second group was our elected officials, the presidency and the members of Congress as well. The money kings, sometimes also referred to as the plutocrats, were a major element in this category, the parasitic class. These were the country's millionaires, its financiers, industrialists, the owners of the transportation and communication networks. Certain families were often mentioned, the Vanderbilts and the Goulds, for example, and at other times populists simply referred generally to the money kings. Why populists spent so much time attacking the money kings, I think, is because that their existence was an affront to producer values. These people did not labor, but they achieved their positions of wealth and power through inheritance, through buying public officials, through expropriating the labor of the producing classes. The money kings were beneficiaries, according to one populist newspaper, of, quote, leech-sapped wealth, unquote. Moreover, the money kings used their wealth in lavish spending and orgies of personal indulgence that offended producer values. They spent their money on themselves. And here I'd like to introduce the second component, the second current or theme in populist ideology, republicanism. The populist reading of history was in terms of its republican tradition. This nation was supposed to be composed of a middling element, middle-class citizens who earned their livings and earned a decent, simple living, who lived in moderation, not extravagance. And the populists projected a society, they said, which Americans live and practice Jeffersonian simplicity. The populist outrage against the money kings was further fueled, therefore, not only by their violation of producer values, but by their violation of our Republican standards of moderation, austerity, at some points, almost an ascetic tradition. And the populists closely examined the lifestyle of these money kings. They unearthed evidence that both producerism and Republican standards were on the verge of being overthrown by their opposites, aristocracy. All signs pointed to the entrenchment of a homegrown aristocracy. The money kings were becoming an American version of Europe's degenerate, licentious nobility. One of the bitterest populist attacks on the money kings focused on their capacity to consume. In the populist press, agrarians read accounts of vast sums spent to purchase palatial homes, yachts, jewels, and this was all wealth created by the producers. A Dakota Ruralist, a populist newspaper, contrasted the lives of farm wives with the lives of the wives of the money kings. While farm wives suffered physical deprivation and mental anguish, their aristocratic counterparts, quote, dressed in rich and costly apparel and wore diamond necklaces, in some instances costing tens of thousands of dollars, yet those who wear them never produced a dollar of any kind of wealth. Some spent on residence of extravagant number and endless variety also occasioned similar comment. The money kings built city homes and country homes, the upkeep of which required an army of servants. They employed expensive decorators to furnish their, quote, castles, unquote, and they ransacked Europe for statues, tapestries, and other appointments. Upon learning that the remodeled Vanderbilt mansion required a fireplace costing $75,000, one populist wrote, "This item is not as important as the question, who paid for it?" Conspicuous consumption, aristocratic trappings, and idle lives testified to the demise of republicanism and the Europeanization of American society. The populist press also paid special attention to the activities of the money kings designed to ennoble themselves. For example, populists learned that they bought crowns and jewels formerly owned by European nobility. They languished at European watering holes. They fussed over titled foreigners who visited the United States, and they spent time trying to marry their daughters off to barons and earls. Commenting on Americans who traveled to Europe, which was spelled in the populist press Y-U-R-R-U-P. Americans who traveled to Europe to socialize with the continent's aristocratic class, one populist newspaper bemoaned the decline of Republican simplicity. Our egalitarian and democratic tradition was being humiliated, quote, by rich toadies who go across the water to grovel in the dust before the worthless aristocracy of Europe, unquote. The populist condemnation of Congress and the president was similar in tone. Congress had abandoned its public trust, its Republican values, and was refusing to act as Republicans demanded, that is, the people's servants. When not doing the bidding of corporate America, or the money kings in this case, congressmen raided the public treasury to appease their yearnings for ease and comfort. Public monies paid for servants, lavish furnishings, junkets, and outlandish services such as free shampoos and shaves available in the senatorial barber shop. With only 86 members, Tom Watson said, the Senate required 219 servants. populists closely examined the official fiscal reports of Congress and published evidence of public funds spent on pen holders, visiting cards, snuff, ice, tumblers, hair oil, and food. In one report, Tom Watson found that the House of Representatives had appropriated $75 for a steam oyster cooker. His response was, quote, "When did you authorize your representatives to buy oyster cookers and charge them to you?" Quote. In the Southern Mercury, a Texas newspaper, they also exposed similar abuses and demanded, quote, "cut off the luxuries," unquote. The thousands of dollars in this case spent on lemonade and mineral water, quote, "to moisten the senatorial throats," unquote, would end when populists took power. The populists would supply, the Southern Mercury said, a barrel of water and gourds. That was sufficient. The presidency also came under a heavy populist barrage for the same thing, violating both producer and Republican standards. In one example, let me mention the controversy, the comment provoked by Grover Cleveland's inauguration in 1894 in the midst of a depression. This affair, his inauguration, spurred populists to contrast the simple dignity of Thomas Jefferson's inauguration with the aristocratic trappings that accompanied the inauguration of Cleveland. Cleveland, a Democrat, the supposed heir to Jeffersonian frugality, had been driven to the Capitol in a fancy coach pulled by 4 black horses. He then delivered a speech denouncing extravagance and returned in a coach pulled by 4 white horses. This was contrasted with Jefferson's inaugural, who had ridden on horseback and walked the other part of the way. And the populists commented, quote, "that was democracy pure and simple." Cleveland's inaugural reeked of what the populists like to call the humbug of royalty. It was, quote, "accompanied with as much pomp and pageantry as the coronation of a monarch in the Orient." And the Southern Mercury asked, "How do Texas toilers like the change from Jefferson to Cleveland?" Cleveland's inauguration was in marked contrast to Republican values which populists cherished. Compare Cleveland's inauguration with the inauguration of Lorenzo Lewelling, a populist governor of Kansas who took office in 1893. Shortly before Lewelling was scheduled to be inducted, the People's Party of Kansas passed a resolution canceling any inaugural ball. The populist triumph, the resolution said, had been a victory, quote, "of the plain people who opposed greed, ostentation of dress, and money for trifles, while those who earn it starve," unquote. The party urged all members to respect this austerity. Jeffersonian simplicity should set the tone. Lewelling supported this decision, declaring that an inaugural ball was, quote, "a relic of barbaric plutocracy," unquote, and not in keeping with populist principles. This is what he said. "About this inaugural ball, I don't like the idea. This idea of going for a sound of revelry by night and having a gathering of wealth, beauty, and fashion isn't the right thing to do. It isn't at all in keeping with the party I represent. The people of Kansas are plain people without frills, and an inaugural ball with its glitter and brilliance isn't a Kansas occasion," quote. I hope this gives you some idea of the several of the currents in populist thought. Perhaps producerism and republicanism might be reactivated today in a world of diminishing resources. In his book, Professor Goodwin on the panel here borrows an idea from a British historian and suggests that it is important for the people to see themselves experimenting in democratic forms. I would like to add a suggestion here that I think it is important for people to see themselves as producers rather than consumers, because I believe that this would be the first step on the way to economic autonomy. The populists like to quote from the Bible and other good books, and I think they would share the feeling and the notion that if I did not work, these worlds would perish. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mchugh. And thank you also for making a transition to our next speaker. The next speaker is Dr. Lawrence Goodwin, who's from the Department of History at Duke University. He's the author of the book, Democratic Promise, The Populist Movement in America. And I mention that book because it has received critical acclaim. It was described by reviewers as a definitive work on the agrarian revolt in the 19th century, and it was also nominated for the National Book Award. So, Dr. Goodwin.
First, let me say that it's a great pleasure to be here. When Marilyn phoned me and asked if I'd come, and I found out who else was coming, no way you could keep me away. It's wonderful to look on the program and see Scott and Helen Nearing described as gardeners, homesteaders, and authors. Yes, all very true, and Democrats and free people also. Two people who know that to live a free life you have to have courage, and that freedom is a product of organized courage. You know, we historians suffer from an occupational hazard of studying dead people. And one thing we are forced to learn is that all people, when they're living, suffer from an enormous conceit, which is that they are modern. And they condescend to all who came before, all the other dead people before them. And I guess the only way psychologically we can cope with this in our own time is to sort of, by a feat of the imagination, leap forward to the year 2200 or something. And then from that perspective, look back on these old-fashioned people who happened to be alive in 1980 on the planet Earth. And if we can do that, I think what we might find is something quaint. I don't think we will look very good in the eyes of the historians of the 23rd century. I think we'll look hopelessly narrow and provincial and reactionary. I think what they'll see is something like this. The 20th century, the century of mature industrialization, is a time when the human race, which had been on the planet for 88 years, 88 generations since Jesus Christ, most of those generations lived in agricultural rhythms of planting time and harvest time, and whole modes of family and habitat and work had become deeply embedded in the human psyche. That in the era of mature industrialization, all of this was destroyed, and that it stirred an enormous amount of anxiety in the people of the world. But from the standpoint of the 23rd century, it looks sort of this way, that there are these railroad tracks going everywhere that sort of symbolize industrialization. And they're sort of running over people. Arms and legs are flying in all directions. Happening in the Soviet Union, and it's happening in Yugoslavia, and it's happening in Berlin, and it's happening in Des Moines, Iowa, and it's happening in Mexico City. But these quaint people of the 20th century, they never talked about the train. They never talked about the engineer. They talked instead, they had this curious, incredible argument for 4 generations about what color hat the engineer would wear. Some folk wanted him to wear a red hat, and other folk wanted him to wear a red, white, and blue hat. And nobody talked about the arms and legs that were flying everywhere. Quaint, curious, provincial people of the 20th century, how they will condescend to us I'm afraid. Well, it's been 10 generations since this all began. Technically, it's about 8 generations. 10 generations ago, there was a signal of hope about human possibility sent across the world in the French and American revolutions, and quickly followed by a reaction 9 generations ago, the generation of Thermidor. And then the Industrial Revolution really got underway. And it's been 8 generations since the Chartists were in the streets in England. And that movement lasted for a full generation, from 8 to 7 generations ago. It's been 6 generations since the bourgeois revolutions of the middle class failed in Europe, and a man named Karl Marx applied a new theory of social analysis to history, wrote a book called The 18th Brumaire. It's been 5 years since the Parliamentary Reform Act, 5 generations since the Parliamentary Reform Act of 1867, and the Paris Commune. And it's 4 generations since the great anarchist dock strikes in London and the agrarian revolt in America. And it's been 3 generations since World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And it's been 2 generations since the Great Depression and the Nazi Revolution in Germany. And it's been 1 generation since man began to conquer space and Chinese peasants conquered China. That's a lot of history in 10 generations. It's possible to ask a question now that we didn't ask, that could not be asked by Thomas Jefferson. What happened to the revolution? What happened to the democratic revolution? What happened to the socialist revolution? We don't know. We have no theories in the 20th century that explain these realities in democratic terms. The words literally don't exist in our languages of political description. We have 2 languages, one rooted in Adam Smith and one rooted in Marx. Neither provides a theory of the democratic state. Neither provides a theory of the kind of insurgent regime that can create a democratic state. You can't create a society you can't imagine. And if you can't imagine a democratic society, you can't have one. And you can't get a democratic society unless some insurgent movement comes to power with democratic values. And therefore, we'd have to have a democratic theory of insurgency. But there is no democratic theory of insurgency in Marxist literature. And there is no democratic theory of insurgency in bourgeois literature. And therefore, perhaps it's not too surprising that mankind in the late 20th century looks around and sees nothing but hierarchy throughout the world. Industrial hierarchy, industrial communist hierarchy, or industrial capitalist hierarchy. We're immobilized. We cannot describe the social realities around us because the words that are necessary to describe that reality are not sanctioned in the dominant literatures of the 2 traditions. So we got one problem that's theoretical. But there's another problem, it seems to me. An overwhelming capacity of modern people to condescend, particularly of universities to condescend to working people, but of middle-class people in general to condescend to working people. So that one looks out across the rural part of the world, or the teeming factory centers of the world either. And if the people are not in revolt, the academics say the people are apathetic and don't understand and suffer from various dependency complexes. And if the people do revolt, the academics say that the people have psychological problems. This latter is the gift of Richard Hofstadter to American political theory. Status anxieties as an expression of authentic reactions to social and economic realities that are so overpowering that if one did not react to them, one would be almost a sleepwalker. Universities teach condescension. It is a way of explaining failure. There are social sciences in the socialist world, and there are social sciences in the capitalist world. What do? The American economists, mainstream economists, are rationalizing to the American young the failure of the American economic system, the undemocratic character of the American economic system. It is called modernization theory. For it to be effective, you have to keep your eyes off the unemployed. They manage to do this with great aplomb. It's helpful to be a white supremacist. That keeps your eyes off blacks. A lot of them are unemployed. Sociology in America has created a word which I treasure called deviant. What is one deviant from? Under close inspection, one is deviant from middle-class white values. The populists were deviant. This room is full of deviants. H.L. Mitchell is deviant. Scott Nearing is deviant. Marilyn Felchek is deviant. I hope I can qualify, be deviant enough to sit in this room, win your affection. Anthropology in America is the study of quaint peoples. History is the apology for the American hierarchy. Precisely the same dynamics are at work in the socialist world, where vanguard parties have put the population in prison and call it democracy. And how does one arm oneself against such highly sanctioned balderdash, such polysyllabic nonsense? Only by falling back on the democratic heritage, only by observing people striving in history in ways that one respects, only by trying hard to avoid condescension. Maybe these people who lived before us, who were not modern now, knew something. I'll tell you what I think they knew. They knew that most people who can see through the shams of a given society are unable to recruit mass movements, that they spend their lives talking to each other in kitchens. And the tragedy of the democratic idea in the 20th century is that people who have those ideas cannot get out of the kitchen. But the populists got out of the kitchen with a cooperative movement that recruited 3 million people. And the lessons they learned in those cooperatives taught them the structure of power in this society. And they came to understand that although they worked hard, bankers got the fruits of their labor. And they pondered this for a while, and they discovered that the American monetary system and the American system of private banking was systematically exploitive. They did not need or require or want a U.S. Department of Agricultural specialist to rationalize that for them. They did not need an economist in an elite university to rationalize that for them. They simply called a spade or a banker, and they analyzed the society. But there are very few people in America, either in economics departments or others, in the Democratic Party today, in the Republican Party today, in the New York Banking Association today, on the staff of the Wall Street Journal today, who can talk coherently about the central component of this economic system, which is private banking. It is not on the agenda of public discussion in America. It is a topic that is terra incognita, beyond the limits of liberalism. Lie, whatever it is that makes this society hierarchical. We are modern, but we cannot talk about the structure of power in our own society. The populists constructed out of their own experience an alternative monetary system, which if enacted tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, would restructure the distribution of income in this society in fundamental ways. The first time any American economist even analyzed this alternative monetary system was in 1976 at my request. And when he came back with the findings, his mouth was open. He said, "This is incredible." And he was also sort of offended and also, I believe, a little diminished to discover that he was the first economist in American history to study it. There are nobody advising Teddy Kennedy or Jimmy Carter or any presidential candidate about a democratic monetary system or democratic social relations or a democratic way to run a city or a seminar or a conference or a university or a farm or a marriage. The idea is not sanctioned. And specific knowledge about how to achieve it is in short supply. We modern people have come a long way from the dreams of the populists and the dreams of the Jeffersonians. And they were not flawless people either. But one would hope if we cannot at least go beyond them, that we might catch up to them. I think maybe if we have a chance in our own time, there are an awful lot of people in this room from all over this country, many of whom I know and many of whom I want to know, that might give us a good start in that direction. Thank you.
I only wish that some of the things that he said about the sociologists, which I am, the economists, which maybe some of the rest of you are, a few of you maybe, and the historians and anthropologists and so forth weren't quite so true. But unfortunately, we all take a chance when we send our kids off to the university. I guess probably most of you are aware of that. There is an awful lot of indoctrination that goes on. The sadder part of it is that it's not any accident that it happens. We'll turn now to our last speaker in this session, who's Dr. James Youngdale from Minneapolis. Dr. Youngdale has been a farmer, he is a writer, and he's now teaching at Augsburg College. He's the author of at least 2 books, one of them entitled Populism, A Psycho-Historical Perspective, and the other book entitled Third Party Footprints.
I'm glad to be here this morning. It's sort of a symbolic homecoming for me. My father went to college here in the 1910s. He was a classmate of Henry Wallace, and I've never been on the campus in my life before, so this was sort of a kind of a moving experience to come back and see some of the buildings. And I think that I recognize some things that we've had on the wall of our home, some photo that my father had from his days at Ames College here. I think this is going to be interesting, what I have to say, in contrast especially with what Marilyn had to say. So I'll just let me get into it in view of the time situation we have. I do view populism as a 20th century phenomenon as well. We had the Nonpartisan League Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota. And if some of you are thinking I'm just talking about the 1880s and 90s, I'm not. I see populism as a much broader and more extensive movement, perhaps, than those who see it only as something that happened in the 1880s and 90s. And I assume that many of you are rather knowledgeable about populism, and so I am going to speak mostly about how populism fits into American history. So my title is Populists in History. Let me launch into this discussion by asking and answering a seemingly simple question: what is populism? My reply to the question is this: populism is radical neo-mercantilism as an ideology, which is expressed in various ways by people groping in some confusion toward changing the social system toward greater egalitarianism. Okay. Now, that's a rather complex sentence is what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about. What does the term radical neo-mercantilism mean? Well, let's go back in history. For 2 or 3 centuries prior to laissez-faire capitalism, that is, old capitalism, the social order is often described with the term mercantilism, that is, old mercantilism. It was a period in history in which the nation-states were organized and in which the state played an active role in shaping and organizing economic activity, most notably the exploration and colonization of the New World. There was emphasis under mercantilism that the various social classes lived with a sense of mutual obligation one to another, a view buttressed in both Catholic and Calvinist religious circles. The early Puritan period in the 17th century in America was mercantilist, a period in which prices were fixed to prevent profiteering and wages were set at supposedly fair rates, and a period in which man was enjoined by religious teaching to practice charity and brotherhood. It is true that Puritanism rather quickly fell into chaos as they were unable to live up to their ideals, and as they finally suffered from delusions about witches. I wish I had a higher rostrum here. I'm trying to read this and I'm having a hard time. All right, let me go on. If you don't mind, I'll hold it up here. Bifocals too. As we know, the mercantilist period was followed by laissez-faire capitalism both in America and Europe, with such ideologists as Adam Smith in England and Thomas Jefferson in America, the latter, of course, famous as the author of the Declaration of Independence. This is not to say that mercantilism died out completely. There was Hamilton. We speak of Alexander Hamilton as a Federalist and a mercantilist, followed by Whigs, Populists, and Progressives, all as neo-mercantilists. We often speak of these conflicting traditions in terms of the dichotomy between federalism and anti-federalism, or between Hamiltonianism and Jeffersonianism, a dichotomy which is useful for understanding the early 19th century at least. There has been a tendency for people who think of themselves as radicals or reformers to identify with the Jeffersonian tradition, and by this token to view Hamilton as the bad guy. In this view, Jefferson is presented as a dissenter, as a defender of individual rights, as the champion of a simple, decentralized agrarian society, all of which are seen as a form of proto-populism. And I think Christine is right that populists themselves looked upon Jefferson as their hero. But this view of Jefferson is all wrong, in my opinion. The fatal flaw of the Jeffersonian ideology lies in its assumption about society that it can be understood as an association of amorphous individuals, each seeking to maximize private liberty. This is an implicit agreement with the Adam Smith theory of rugged individualism and free competition on the part of competing producers. Just as Smith argued that this view of society would make for a viable moral order in which free competition functioned like an invisible hand, Jefferson used the phrase, "the pursuit of happiness," as a euphemism for an ideal moral order in a state of natural harmony. The assumption about rugged individualism as a cornerstone for a theory of social order meant that, by logical definition, there is no room for concepts of social process, social psychology, or even social reform, other than the moral perfection of individuals. This view of society, in terms of atomistic individualism, is sometimes called American innocence. In history, the innocent American has been a person who can only react with anger and even violence when he is treated unkindly or unjustly within the social system. Like a child, the innocent American can only have a temper tantrum when things go wrong. Temper tantrums in the adult world take the form of bigotry toward racial or religious minorities, conspiracy theories about history, and finally violence of various kinds, such as lynching of Negroes or Indians. Stokely Carmichael has observed that violence is as an American as apple pie. It is not my intent here to elaborate upon the flaws in the Jeffersonian ideology, but to only lay bare the notion that Jeffersonian ideology can only produce temper tantrum reform. This point becomes all the more evident when we look in the 19th century at persons who laid claim to Jefferson. There was Andrew Jackson, slave owner, Indian hater, and frontier jingoist. There was Senator John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, the leading ideologist for slavery, plantation agrarianism, and states' rights. And there was William Jennings Bryan, a conservative petty capitalist from Nebraska, who was explicitly anti-populist in his political career, even though he made empty phrases about the common people and was called the Great Commoner. The populists in American history were those who were breaking away from rugged individualism and away from the Jeffersonian ideology, regardless of their own perception of things. They were groping to redefine old mercantilism in new ways, which would make for justice and egalitarianism between various social interests. This groping drew inspiration from many sources, such as the cooperative Commonwealth vision of Robert Owen, the social gospel movement, and the single tax plan of Henry George, to name just three of these sources. And I could add Bellamy's Looking Backward. As time passed, more and more populists became conscious socialists, but more often following certain revisionists than Karl Marx directly. Especially after the Social Democratic Party was organized in 1901 by such persons as Debs, Hillquit, and Berger, socialist ideology emerged in rural America as well as urban America and began to influence new populist movements, notably in North Dakota and Minnesota, where the Nonpartisan League and the Farmer Labor Party took control of state governments at different times. In Minnesota, there was the famous 1934 Farmer Labor Platform written by Howard Y. Williams, a social gospel minister, announcing the failure of capitalism and calling for the creation of a cooperative commonwealth. In general, I have been describing a kind of right-to-left shift among those whom we call populists, as they became disillusioned with the American dream to achieve middle-class affluence. While some populists finally moved toward a belief in socialism of some kind, as I suggest, I think that the great majority of people in populist movements stopped short of being system changers. And at the same time, many of them harbored a longing for the American dream, even when it seemed most elusive. Thus, I think a typical populist was a person with a divided mind, looking back to a golden age of the past and also looking ahead to a rather full catalog of reform, which might have implications for reforming the system, but not necessarily with conscious intent to do so. It is this average or typical populist, as I am describing such a person, who fits my category, radical neo-mercantilist. By definition, then, a populist lives with conflicting values, and by definition, a populist is a person who can vacillate at times, sometimes switching back to the old American or Jeffersonian dream, as did Tom Watson, and then under new circumstances, switching again to become a populist or even a socialist. Now, it is important to distinguish populism from mainstream progressivism, which emerged around Teddy Roosevelt after the turn of the century. The Teddy Roosevelt form of neo-mercantilism, along with later New Deals and Fair Deals, have all been movements of limited reform, which have been enacted on a piecemeal basis with the collaboration of important banking and corporation leadership and think tanks. By contrast, populist movements have been more genuinely drawn from a grassroots constituency, a constituency which was forced through time and by adversity to examine and adapt new ideological outlooks to replace a failing American dream. It was only as these new outlooks took root that we can speak of the emergence of populism as a breaking away from Jeffersonian rugged individualism. Populists displayed a crucial and pivotal role in stimulating the emergence of mainstream neo-mercantilism, in forcing the hand of a Teddy Roosevelt to become a reformer, as both a trust buster and a trust regulator, and later in providing a counterweight on the left upon Franklin Roosevelt. Paradoxically, many populists were seduced by these progressives at the same time, at the same time hoping, no doubt, to secure a half a loaf, if not a whole one. Too few of them noticed that a J.P. Morgan lawyer was Teddy Roosevelt's key advisor, that William Jennings Bryan was a simple-minded Jeffersonian, or that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was unable to cure the Depression until war spending came along. A great seducer in Minnesota was Hubert Humphrey, super salesman for the Cold War and the chief sponsor of the Concentration Camp Act of 1950. But when all this is said and done, the populists have been effective gadflies. They have been movers and shakers, so to speak, who have influenced the course of American history, even though few of them have been elected to office, and even though our history books pay scant attention to them. Now, let me make a few brief observations about further implications of my viewpoint, observations which will further illuminate an understanding of populism. I stress that I define populism in terms of ideological content, specifically as persons or movements in tension between rugged individualism and some vision of socialism, but coming to rest between these two poles as radical neo-mercantilism. By the same token, specific forms of behavior do not necessarily define populism. For example, membership in a cooperative does not necessarily imply populism, for some co-op members have joined only for the profit-sharing aspect while retaining a totally conservative social outlook. The idea of a third party is not necessarily populistic, for third parties emerge across the entire spectrum: George Wallace on the right, Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moosers at the center, and various socialist parties on the left. A third party is not a precondition for populism. The Nonpartisan League in North Dakota, for example, won its victory in 1916 within the Republican Party by winning in a primary election. And you're going to see the movie Northern Lights here, I think tomorrow sometime. And it's an excellent movie. I hope you all make a point of seeing it. But the one lacking thing in the movie is that they fail to point out that the political victory they celebrate at the end was a victory within the Republican Party. And you may get the impression from the movie that this was kind of a third-party victory. It was not. Then going on. Behavior which falls under the rubric of mass action is not necessarily populistic. For again, mass action can be linked with any ideology in the spectrum at different times and different places. And the same can be said of antitrust or anti-monopoly attitudes, which can only mean sometimes that it is the ideology of petty capitalism, or the Jeffersonians who simply want to destroy the trusts and go back to the golden age of the 19th century. But I disagree with those behavioralists among social scientists who carefully quantify some form of behavior, but who fail to link behavior with forms of ideology. We don't learn much about being a dairy farmer by counting the fence posts around the cow pasture. And I fear that this is too much the kind of research being performed in our institutions of higher learning by behavioralists. My argument here stands in opposition as well to those forms of psychology which we commonly call behaviorism, hedonism, or just plain rat psychology. All of these psychologies are stimulus response in their essence, as if response flows from stimulus in an ideological vacuum. For rats, yes, but people are born in culture, and their response to a given stimulus varies from person to person, depending on values, which in turn vary with ethnic and religious backgrounds. For example, my argument that one must look at ideology as well as stimulus is at odds with those behavioralists and materialists in the field of history and social science who spend their time counting fence posts or looking at the extent of hard times or whatever, all the time ignoring ideology and assuming that a radical response will more or less automatically flow from the stimulus of hard times. This kind of social psychology is grossly simplistic and finally profoundly wrong. There is not time here to discuss an alternative social psychology. I might say that I have developed this somewhat in my book on populism, which the chairman noted, in which I devise a social psychology from the views of Alfred Adler, not Sigmund Freud. Going on, I have already referred to my explanation for the tendency of populists to vacillate, sometimes from left to right and sometimes from right to left. In this context, a comment or two about the old controversy between Richard Hofstadter and Norman Pollock is in order. It is clear that Hofstadter sees only one side of vacillation, as he points to the tendency of populists to become sour, angry bigots through time. Hofstadter seems to have based his model on the example of Georgia populist Tom Watson, and in the process he failed to look for other examples of populists who remain true to their cause, or those who turn more fully to the left as socialists. On the other hand, Pollock idealized populists as decent, humane Democrats, but fails to note that some do switch back to their rugged individualist worldview and sometimes to become bigots in the process. In a sense, I am able to say that both Pollock and Hofstadter are partly right, and that both fail to understand the social psychology at work among people caught in the larger historical process. Let me conclude with a few comments about populism in the 1970s and 80s. First of all, I fear that my definition of populism is not widely accepted or used. Not long ago, for example, a headline writer for the New York Times referred to Ronald Reagan's populist coalition in a headline to the news article. Well, and Ronald Reagan, remember, when he made his announcement speech, quoted Tom Paine, and it's entirely appropriate. He should do so with my view of Jefferson and Tom Paine. Not long ago, for example, I'm repeating. 4 years ago, political pundits and the American public accepted Jimmy Carter's description of himself as the populist, without laughing loudly up their sleeves and without stopping to inquire about the significance of Carter's membership in the Trilateral Commission, the latest policy-making think tank operation, this one on an international level. Clearly, neither Carter nor Reagan are moving towards some version of socialist or radical neo-mercantilism. The notion of socialism for the rich, of course, better fits these men, and we can think of military socialism in that the armed services enjoy socialized medicine, recreation, and plush retirement plans. I'm sure that few sense the paradox of the emerging garrison state in America, which contains germs of socialism in the context of old-fashioned conservative values. In Germany, this was called National Socialism, Nazi for short. Looking now at popular culture in America at the present, one can sense a good deal of unease and discontent. Yet I think much of this discontent is linked with American innocence, with striving for liberation on a purely personal basis, giving rise to such terms as the me generation and the new narcissism. Even among many social activists, people who join in promoting certain good causes, it is difficult to detect populism. For example, I know of advocates of solar power and clean water who also advocate the abolition of the Social Security system. These may be isolated examples, but they do illustrate the continuing confusion among so-called populists who look both backward and forward at the same time. I fear that much of current populism is Tory populism, a term I sometimes use to describe those dissenters who look back to a restoration of the golden age of Jeffersonian rugged individualism. I fear that these innocents, like the innocents of the past, will under growing frustration as inflation and other adverse social pressures deepen, will start to kick their dogs, beat their children, and finally search for a new scapegoat against whom to vent bigotry and violence, unless a hot war provides this outlet. These are the worst of times. Perhaps saying so will help to move us toward the best of times. There is much to emulate in past populist movements. To learn about our history will help us even more toward the best of times. In this regard, I applaud the holding of this symposium. Thank you.
We've run over our time, but I would like to give anyone who is in the audience who would like to ask a short question to do so, or to make a short comment if they would like to do so. Yes. It'd be better.
addressing Professor Goodwin, and I claim the honorary title of deviant. My name is Lem Harris, but I would like to ask for a little deeper thinking on the professor's part on the matter of democracy in the Soviet Union. He made a reference there that limited though ours is, theirs is limited also. I could say the same, but the inference is that there is no democracy there. I have lived and worked there in factories and farms, and I think, if you stop and think, you'll understand that on any farm, the vote of the membership determines who is director and the policies. Also in any factory, the trade union, which exists in all factories, has rights and powers equal to management. No one can be fired without their agreement, and so forth. As you get higher in the scale, the problems of democracy get more difficult. We know that in the United States. And so in considering whether the people of the Soviet Union have democratic rights, just bear in mind that there's a lot of rights on the lower level. As you go higher, the problem increases.
Did you want to comment?
Mr. Harris, my own view, this is a very old-fashioned century, and political ideologies of the 20th century are the so-called left and right, which incidentally represent ways of thinking about human society that I also think are anachronistic. I don't think mankind is linear, as it runs from left to right. That's an absurd way of thinking about politics. In any case, I think that these ways of thinking we have are old-fashioned. I think the simplest way to understand the crisis of democracy and the crisis of capitalism and the crisis of Marxism is to understand that these are hierarchies, and that we don't have a democratic theory in the 20th century, and that there are tortured explanations available in both camps about the transparent failure of each. I simply am not going to participate in the tortured explanation while retaining goodwill toward those who do. I think we have to, this is the least creative political century of the last four. It is as if mankind ceased to think when after 18, well, take your choice, either after the Grundrisse or Das Kapital. That was the last gasp of human creativity. Certainly hasn't been much coming out of the 20th century that one can respect, unless one is beguiled by modernization theory. It's time for us to get our heads together and start thinking about democracy and hierarchy, and not, in my opinion, apologizing for the transparent and crashing failures of the 19th and 18th centuries.